Our final speaker today is Laurence Vance from the Wayland Institute. Laurence will be presenting the Lou Church Memorial Lecture on Religion and Economics this afternoon at 2 o'clock in this room. At this time, he's going to be speaking briefly about his book on Christianity and War.
It was 3 years ago that I spoke at the Austrian Scholars Conference in 2005 about the first edition of my small collection of essays, which I titled Christianity and War and Other Essays Against the Warfare State. There I closed my remarks by saying that my only regret was that I did not have some of my more recent anti-war articles from LouRockwell.com included in the book. I stated that if God gave me the time and the health, I hope to have the opportunity to include those additional articles in a second edition, along with even more essays against the warfare state. Well, not only has God given me both the time and the health, I have now included those additional articles in a new edition, along with more essays against the warfare state than I ever thought I would write. As I will mention more fully in my Lou Church Memorial Lecture later today, I don't suppose there's anything I write and speak about with more fervor than the biblical, economic, and political fallacies of religious people. This is especially true regarding the general subject of Christianity and war. If there is any group of people that should be opposed to war, militarism, the warfare state, state worship, and an aggressive foreign policy, it is Christians, and especially conservative, evangelical, and fundamentalist Christians who claim to strictly follow the dictates of Scripture and worship the Prince of Peace. As a Bible-believing Christian, I am ashamed to have to acknowledge that in the church can be found some of the greatest supporters of the state, its president, its military, and its wars. In fact, some Christians turn into babbling idiots when it comes to the subjects of war, the warfare state, the military, the U.S. empire, and killing for the state. Many Christian leaders still moonlight as apologists for Bush and his war. Even Christians who are otherwise sound in the faith, who are not fooled by Bush's pseudo-Christianity, who believe that the less government we have, the better, who don't support the war in Iraq, and who oppose an aggressive foreign policy, get indignant when you question the institution of the U.S. military. It is true that Christian support for the Iraq war has declined. Unfortunately, however, it is generally not out of a principled opposition to war and the warfare state, but only because the war didn't turn out as planned, the war is taking too long, the war has been mismanaged, the war is costing too much, or the war has resulted in too many dead and wounded American troops. What a shame that the number of dead and wounded Iraqis is of no concern to most Christian Americans. And why should it be? After all, in their eyes, the Iraqis are all just a bunch of dumb ragheads, Muslim heathens, or incorrigible terrorists. How can so many religious people get it so wrong? I have explained why in some of my LRC articles over the years. Thinking that the war in Iraq was in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks, believing that Saddam Hussein was another Hitler, supposing that Iraq was a threat to the United States, viewing the war in Iraq as a modern-day crusade against Islam, assuming that the United States needed to protect Israel from Iraq, equating the Republican Party with the party of God, blindly following the conservative movement, possessing a warped God and country complex, having a love affair with the military, apathy, and just plain ignorance. I first began writing on the general subject of Christianity and war soon after Bush invaded Iraq. I was appalled at the degree of Christian support for Bush and his war. Little did I know that this would turn into a 5-year obsession, an obsession that I intend to maintain as long as Christians continue to make apologies for the state, its president, its military, and its wars. And little did I know that my obsession will also have life-changing consequences. My first article for righ-wing on the subject was actually called Christianity and War. I had just written it when, while attending a conference here in Auburn, Lew Rockwell asked me to write something for him on that topic. Naturally, I immediately sent it to him, since he had turned me down on several previous occasions. After 12 more essays that addressed the themes of Christians joining the military, Christians killing in war, the evils of war, standing armies, the follies of the Crimean War, World War I, and the Iraq War, Christian justification for the Iraq War, and the U.S. global empire, I published at the beginning of 2005 the first edition of Christianity and War and Other Essays Against the Warfare State. After the completion of these essays, I honestly thought I would have nothing else to say about the subject. I remember writing Lew Rockwell and telling him that I was in a writing slump. But even as that book went to press, I realized that much more could and should be said. So I continued writing. Then as the book began circulating and I began to write even more, the attacks started. Because I dared to oppose the war, and especially because I attacked root and branch, the military, and the warfare state, I was a communist, a liberal, a leftist, a hippie, a peacenik, a Quaker, a pacifist dog, a traitor, a pinko traitor, a coward, an appeaser, an anarchist, an anti-war weenie. And of course, I was also an anti-American MF SOB a-hole. As the war dragged on, the continued Christian support for Bush, the war, and the military only confirmed that there was much more that needed to be written. By the beginning of 2007, I realized that a new edition of Christianity and War was needed. I am pleased to report that a new, greatly expanded second edition has just been published, and this is available in the bookstore. I have repeated in the introduction to the new edition what I said in the introduction to the first edition. These essays have one underlying theme: opposition to the warfare state that robs us of our liberty, our money, and in some cases our life. Conservatives who decry the welfare state while supporting the warfare state are terribly inconsistent. The two are inseparable. Libertarians who are opposed to the war on principle but support the state's bogus war on terrorism, even as they remain silent about the U.S. global empire, are likewise contradictory. Christians who condone the warfare state and its nebulous crusades against evil have been duped. There is nothing Christian about the state's aggressive militarism, its senseless wars, its interventions into the affairs of other countries, and its expanding empire. I also said that Christian enthusiasm for the state, its wars, and its politicians is an affront to the Savior, contrary to Scripture, and a demonstration of the profound ignorance many Christians have of history. This second edition is likewise dedicated to Lew Rockwell, without whose encouragement most of the essays in it would never have been published. And besides, has there ever been a more consistent opponent of war, militarism, and the warfare state than Lew Rockwell? Few individuals alive today could honestly receive that accolade. It is in this consistent position that first attracted me to the Mises Institute in the early 1990s. And it is this consistent position that keeps me coming back. My book now contains 79 essays, organized under the headings of Christianity and War, War and Peace, the military, Christianity in the military, the Iraq War, other wars, and the U.S. global empire. The essay spanned the 4-year period from 2003 to 2007. Although many of them reference contemporary events, the principles discussed in all of them are timeless. War, militarism, empire, interventionism, the warfare state, and the Christian attitude toward these things. New to this edition is a foreword by Mike Reith, a retired Air Force major. Mike underwent a glorious transformation from a Christian warmonger to a Christian peace advocate, due in part to his faithful reading of righ-wing. I am very grateful that he was willing to write the foreword, since I am often attacked for criticizing the military when I did not serve. Ask Major Reith if he recommends military service for a Christian young person, or anyone for that matter. Go ahead and ask him. He served for over 20 years. The first chapter of the book is the largest and contains 20 essays under the general rubric of Christianity and War. Besides discussing that subject, here I introduce some real Christian ministers who spoke out against the war, point out the biblical errors of 2 other ministers who favored war, give a test to Christians to see if they are warmongers, identify the Christian axis of evil, expose the hypocrisy of Christian warmongers, reveal the unholy desire of Christians to legitimize killing in war, declare what the church should be saying about U.S. foreign policy, discuss the fallacy of those who say that the commandment, thou shalt not kill, never applies to killing in war, describe the use of religion in wartime by the state, explain how killing for the state can be murder, explore the attitude of the early Christians toward war, and also answer the questions, what about Hitler, and what happened to the Southern Baptists? In Chapter 2, War and Peace, I examine the evils of war and warmongers and the benefits of peace. Jefferson's aversion to war and his foreign policy of peace, commerce, friendship, and no entangling alliances should be our country's model. The Bush Doctrine be damned. Many Christians who talk about being pro-life are only pro-life when it comes to a baby in the womb. They are not concerned in the least about the killing of foreigners on the battlefields we have made their neighborhoods. They claim to worship the Prince of Peace, but instead are devotees of the God of war. They claim to have peace with God, but refuse to live at peace with their fellow man. In Chapter 3, the military, I discuss the evils of standing armies and militarism, including a critical look at the U.S. military. I'm often accused of being anti-military, of not appreciating the sacrifices that have been made so that I can have the freedom to speak English and write my trash criticizing the military. If the military were actually engaged in defending the United States, guarding the borders, and patrolling the coasts, then I would be as pro-military as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But that doesn't mean that I would be pro-war or pro-empire. The purpose of the military has been perverted beyond all recognition. What do instituting regime changes, providing disaster relief and humanitarian aid, spreading democracy by force, garrisoning the planet with bases, and stationing troops in countries that most Americans have never heard of have to do with defending the United States? I don't support the troops. I take the position that the troops are ultimately responsible for prosecuting this senseless and immoral war. Bush and Cheney haven't fired a single shot. Look at it this way. If the government told someone to kill his mother, any American would be outraged if he, under any circumstances, went and did it. But then if the government tells someone to put on a uniform and go kill some Iraqi's mother, the typical American puts a yellow ribbon on his car and says we should support the troops. But why should the response be any different? Why should morality be put off just because a uniform is put on. In Chapter 4, Christianity in the Military, I show to be illogical, immoral, and unscriptural the idea that Christians should have anything to do with the military. Many evangelicals have a military fetish. But even pastors in conservative churches that know better do nothing to discourage the young men in their churches from joining the military to bomb, maim, and kill for the state in some foreign war that has nothing to do with defending the United States. In Chapter 5, the war in Iraq, the folly of U.S. policy in Iraq is laid bare in 15 essays. The terrible truth about this war is that every soldier who died in Iraq died for a lie. It especially amazes me that so many Christians still support this incredible war. The attempt to defend the war based on so-called just war principles is especially appalling. If there were ever a war that violated every just war principle known to man, it is this war. In Chapter 6, Other Wars, I chronicle the evils of war and the warfare state in 4 specific wars: the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and World War II. No matter how much death and destruction that war brings, people throughout history never seem to tire of going to war and supporting the troops in loyal obedience to the lying and killing machines known as their governments. In Chapter 7, the U.S. Global Empire, I reveal and critique the beginnings, growth, extent, nature, and consequences of the U.S. empire of bases and troops that encircles the globe. Bush's model for Iraq is supposed to be South Korea, a country where the U.S. has had troops since the end of our war there in 1953. Will we still have troops in Iraq in 55 years? They will be there twice as long if McCain has his way. Although my book contains critiques from a decidedly Christian perspective of the Iraq War, U.S. foreign policy, and the military, it is not just a book for Christians. Atheists are welcome to purchase as many copies as they want. Some of my greatest supporters are not necessarily concerned about religion at all. I cannot tell you how many veterans have written me expressing not only support for my writings, but also grief for the men they killed in the service of the U.S. government. Most of my critiques of the military in the Iraq War have nothing to do with religion at all. The book also contains much original research on the number and location of U.S. troops that maintain our global empire. For years, I had read in various publications that the United States had troops in over 100 countries. I was determined to find out not only if that was true, but also how many troops in how many countries. I succeeded using the Defense Department's own data and have tried to periodically update the results of my initial research. Although it has only been available for a short time, my new edition of Christianity in War seems to have been better received than the previous edition. I guess the first edition must have been somewhat of a shock. It was certainly a shock to people who no longer consider me to be their friends. It is also getting harder and harder for Christians to defend the war in Iraq. There are, however, enough of them that still do. Just look at the support that the theocratic warmonger Mike Huckabee receives in the Bible Belt. In view of the terrible Christian track record on support for the state, its wars, and its military, I suspect that this will not be the last edition of this book. Thank you. I say simply, we're not in the Old Testament, we're not Jews, Bush is not God, and the U.S. Army's not Israel's army. It's totally irrelevant.
Oh, yes, we have many Muslims working in the kitchen. They'll feed you. So then I tell people this. There are Jews and Muslims that are cooperating. They're not all suicide bombers, just as not all Christians went on the Crusades. And several people. I haven't thought of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Maybe you can write the foreword to the next edition.
I wonder if you're familiar with my website, which is www.jesus-on-taxes.com, and the essay there entitled "Jesus of Nazareth, the Legal Tax Protester," which will answer many of the questions about like the one asked, as well as the one that's always brought up, render and receive.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't heard of it. Yes, sir.
How do you explain to your faithful friends the principle of self-defense?
Well, I don't object to self-defense, but the United States warring in Iraq is anything but self-defense, is what I point out.
So you accept that there is moral, a war in self-defense?
Certainly. If Iraqi troops landed on the coast of Florida, I'd be the first one to get my gun out. So I'm not opposed to that at all.
War against Hitler or not?
Well, there's a lot that goes into that I couldn't even begin to discuss right now.
Could you name, let's say, there's three basic tenets?
Three basic tenets that would be a justification for war? Well, self-defense. And I'd have to think long and hard about anything else.
The reason why I ask that is because if you wait for those facts to arrive, I'm not seeing this in a hostile way.
Well, if they were pretty close, okay. But if they're off the coast of Africa, I wouldn't say that we should all of a sudden go to war. So yes, there is some kind of a fine line there, right?
Question in the back. So that the Iraqis have had the right to attack the U.S. as the U.S. is getting ready to attack it.
So,
Iraq has the right to defense the war.
certainly.
No American thinks so, right?
And
These things have to apply across the board.
And you could also consider we've been warring against Iraq with sanctions and all these things for many years and aggressing against them for many years. They would be perfectly justified in coming over here to attack us. Of course, it wouldn't be a good idea, but
the weapons that Saddam Hussein allegedly received, I believe some of them probably came from the United States in defense of Iraq against their war in Iran. So, whose blood is...
right. I point that out in one of my essays, how we supported Iraq against their war against Iran. And we have a history of supporting, dictators like Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murderers in history. That hasn't bothered our government a bit to support people like that. And there'll be more in the future that I'm sure we'll be willing to support as well.
Did the CIA not unseat Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected leader of
Iran.
Way back there, which may have been given...
Right. So blowback, we just keep experiencing blowback from all of our actions. And even if we stopped right now, and changed our foreign policy, who knows how long it would take to get back on track.
I come from a strange country north of here called Canada. It's strange in a number of respects, but it's strange in this context in that it's a country that sent troops to Afghanistan but not to Iraq. And I would be interested, you haven't talked about Afghanistan, and I wonder if you think that the campaign in Afghanistan meets the self-defense test that we've been talking about or not.
Well, I don't recall any troops from Afghanistan that ever attacked us, nor were any of the hijackers on 9/11 from Afghanistan. I think it would have been a lot easier, as I think Ron Paul suggested, pay someone to go in and find Osama bin Laden instead of going into Afghanistan and killing how many thousands of Afghanis we don't know, plus the American troops. So.
How does we look like this, or an idea, or a movement, or whatever you want to call recent research, how does one deal with that, and how do you deal with the fact that it doesn't matter what you say, you are
Well, it's very hard to deal with Christians who have that attitude, and frankly, I don't have an answer. That's why I just keep writing and writing, and hopefully, eventually it's going to sink in. And it does to some extent, because I get emails all the time from people who say, you know, I've changed my mind, or I was in the military and I regret killing these people, and I appreciate righ-wing and how much they've learned from that. So I don't know how to, other than to just keep plugging away at these people and hoping and praying that they open their eyes and get their eyes off the Republican Party and the conservative movement and get into the Bible they profess to believe.
The commandment is, thou shalt not kill.
Thank you very much.